You know, after 40 years sitting on this bench, I truly believed there was nothing left that could surprise me. I thought I had heard every excuse, every explanation, every story people could bring into my courtroom. But one morning in March, a woman walked in that made me stop and question everything I thought I understood about struggle, dignity, and what justice is really supposed to look like. What I heard that day stayed with me long after the courtroom emptied, and the decision I made still weighs on my heart. Let me tell you exactly what happened, because this is more than a story about a car boot. It's a story about life breaking someone down and what happens when the law chooses to lift them back up. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years. Every morning I follow the same routine. I wake up early before the city really stirs. I move quietly so I don't wake my wife. We've been married a long time, and she can tell how my day will go just by how I tie my tie. I make my coffee strong and black, no sugar, no cream. I've had it the same way for decades. My father immigrated to this country from Italy with almost nothing. He worked hard, never complained, and believed deeply in personal responsibility, but he also believed in mercy. He used to tell me, Frank, anyone can follow rules when life is easy. Character shows when life gets hard. I carry those words with me every single day I put on this robe. I get to the courthouse at 8:15 every morning. I've done that since the 1980s. Christina, my clerk, is usually already there. She greets me with a smile and hands me my coffee before I even ask. She knows exactly how I like it. That morning when she handed it to me, I remember the smell was especially strong. Maybe it was just one of those mornings where your senses are sharper. I sat at my desk and started reviewing the case files, parking tickets, speeding citations, unregistered vehicles, the usual mix. But as I flipped through the pages, I felt something I've learned to trust over the years. A quiet feeling in my gut telling me that this day would matter. When court began, the first few cases moved quickly. People explained themselves. Some were honest, some weren't. I listened the same way I always do. I believe every person deserves to be heard. Then Christina called the next case. I looked up and read the name out loud. I watched as a woman stood slowly from the gallery. She hesitated for just a moment before walking toward the podium. That hesitation told me something already. People who hesitate like that are carrying weight. As she stepped forward, I noticed how carefully she walked, like she didn't want to draw attention to herself. She held her purse close to her body. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. She looked tired, but not just physically. She looked worn down. I asked her to tell me what brought her into my courtroom. She took a breath first, a deep one. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. She said her car had been booted due to unpaid parking tickets. She said she couldn't afford to have the boot removed. I nodded and asked her why the tickets hadn't been paid. That's when her voice cracked just slightly. She said, "Your Honor, I lost my job 2 weeks ago. I'm a single mom. I need my car to get my kids to school and to look for work." The room went quiet. I've learned to recognize that silence. That wasn't boredom. That was people listening. I asked her how many children she had. She told me 2. I asked their ages. She said 6 and 9. I thought about my own grandchildren. I thought about how much trust children place in the adults who care for them. I asked her what kind of work she had been doing. She told me she worked full-time in retail until the store closed without warning. I could hear the embarrassment in her voice. Losing a job can make even strong people feel ashamed, even when it isn't their fault. I asked her how long the tickets had been unpaid. She explained that when money got tight, she made choices. Rent came first, food came first, school supplies came first, parking tickets came last. As she spoke, I watched her hands. They were shaking just a little. That kind of shaking doesn't come from lying. It comes from fear. I remember thinking to myself, this woman isn't irresponsible. She's overwhelmed. I asked her if she had any income at the moment. She shook her head and said no, not yet. She said she had interviews scheduled but couldn't attend them without transportation. That's when I leaned forward. I wanted her to know I was listening. I wanted her to know she mattered in my courtroom. I told her something I believe deeply. I said life can knock you down hard. What matters is whether we help you get back up. Her eyes filled with tears immediately. She tried to stop them, but she couldn't. I gave her a moment. I never rush moments like that. I asked Christina how much the boot removal fee was. When I heard the amount, I felt my chest tighten. For someone without a job, that wasn't just money, that was a wall. I had to pause. I took a deep breath. This is where being a judge becomes more than reading statutes. This is where discretion meets humanity. I thought about my parents. I thought about families living paycheck to paycheck. I thought about how close any of us are to falling if one thing goes wrong. I looked at her and said, I'm going to remove the boot. I'm going to dismiss these tickets, and I want you to focus on getting back on your feet. She gasped. She put her hand over her mouth. Tears rolled down her face. She nodded again and again, unable to speak. She thanked me over and over until I gently stopped her. I told her, this is not a free pass. You pay it back by taking care of your children and contributing when you can. That's all I ask. She promised me she would. As she walked away, I watched her shoulders relax. For the first time since she entered my courtroom, she could breathe. That moment right there is why I still sit on this bench. Now let me pause for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever needed just one break to change everything? One moment that gave you hope again? Leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if this story is hitting you, hit that like button for me. Court continued, but deep down, I knew the day wasn't finished teaching lessons yet. After that young mother left my courtroom, I took a sip of my coffee and let out a slow breath. Moments like that stay with you. They remind you why this job matters. But I've learned something over the years. When a morning starts with emotion, it usually isn't finished yet. Court kept moving. Christina called the next few cases, and I handled them the way I always do. I listened, I asked questions, I ruled fairly, but my mind kept drifting back to that woman and her children. I hoped she would find work quickly. I hoped that one decision would give her just enough room to stand up again. About an hour later, Christina called another case involving a booted vehicle. I looked down at the file before I even looked up. Different name, different address, different circumstances. I could tell just by the paperwork that this case wasn't going to feel the same. I looked up and watched a woman stand from the gallery. The way she moved immediately caught my attention. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She walked straight toward the podium with confidence, almost impatience. She was well-dressed, stylish coat, designer handbag hanging from her arm. Her phone was in her hand, and she was still typing as she approached. I cleared my throat gently and asked her to put the phone away. She sighed, rolled her eyes slightly, and slipped it into her bag, like I was asking her to do me a favor instead of follow courtroom rules. I noticed that. I always notice that. I asked her to confirm her name and address. She answered quickly without really looking at me. She kept shifting her weight like she had somewhere else to be. I asked her why her vehicle had been booted. She shrugged, not embarrassed, not apologetic. She shrugged and said, "Parking tickets." I asked her how many. Christina read the number. It was more than the previous case, quite a bit more. I asked how long they'd been unpaid. She tilted her head slightly and said, "I don't know. A while. I travel a lot." That word bothered me. Travel. It wasn't the word itself. It was the way she said it. Casual, dismissive. I asked her if she understood that unpaid tickets eventually result in a boot. She smiled, not nervously, not awkwardly. She smiled like she had expected this moment and wasn't impressed by it. She said, "I figured I'd deal with it when it happened." I leaned back in my chair. I removed my glasses and held them in my hand. That's something I do when I need to slow myself down and think. I asked her if the boot caused her any hardship. She laughed. I heard it clearly. The sound echoed across my courtroom, and for a moment I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She said, "It's annoying, that's all. Annoying." I glanced toward Christina. She didn't say a word, but I saw her close her eyes briefly. That reaction told me everything. I asked her how much the boot removal fee was. She waved her hand and said, "It's not a big deal. I just don't like being inconvenienced." That word again, inconvenienced. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. I thought about the single mother from earlier. I thought about fear versus inconvenience. I thought about the difference between being stuck and being annoyed. I asked her if she had the money to pay the fine. She laughed again and said, "Of course. I spend more than that on shoes. I'm not going to lie to you." I felt my blood pressure rise. It took everything in me not to raise my voice. Instead, I took a deep breath and reminded myself who I was and where I was. I leaned forward and looked her directly in the eyes. I said, "This is a court of law, not a shopping mall, not a joke." She smiled again, almost amused, like she didn't believe she was in any real trouble. Then she said something I will never forget. She said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I really don't have time for this. I have a lunch reservation." I heard a gasp from the gallery. I felt the tension in the room rise instantly. My courtroom is small, and moments like that hit everyone at once. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't going to end the way she thinks it will. I said to her very calmly, "You'll make time, because in my courtroom, everyone makes time." She crossed her arms. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She just stood there waiting, like she was bored. I asked her what she did for work. She said she was a consultant. She said it proudly, like that title explained everything about her situation. I asked her if she understood why parking laws exist. She said, "I get it, but honestly, these tickets are nothing to me. Nothing." I felt disappointment more than anger. Disappointment that someone could stand in front of the law and feel so far above it. I said something my father taught me a long time ago. I said money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy character, and it can't buy your way above the law. She rolled her eyes again. That's when I heard a sound from the back of the courtroom, a quiet laugh. Not loud, but clear enough to catch my attention. I looked up and saw a man stand slowly. He was wearing a dark suit. He had a calm, professional presence. He raised his hand slightly and asked to be heard. I asked him to identify himself. He said his name and told me he was an assistant United States attorney. The courtroom went silent immediately. Even the woman at the podium stopped smiling. I looked at Christina. She looked back at me, her eyebrows raised just slightly. The man said, "Your Honor, I wasn't planning to speak today, but I believe the court should be aware of something important." I felt that same feeling in my gut again, stronger this time. I asked him to continue. He said the woman standing before me was currently under federal investigation. He said it calmly, like he was reading from a report. I looked down at the woman. The color drained from her face instantly. It was like watching confidence evaporate in real time. She tried to speak, but the man gently raised his hand and said, "Ma'am, please don't interrupt." He handed Christina a sealed envelope. Christina brought it to me. I held it in my hands for a moment before opening it. I could feel the weight of it, not physically, but emotionally. I opened it and started reading. My heart sank. Allegations of financial fraud, large sums of money, multiple victims, ongoing investigation. I had to pause. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I took a deep breath. In 40 years on this bench, I had never seen entitlement collapse so quickly. The assistant U.S. attorney told me that federal agents were already in the building. Time felt like it slowed down. I looked at the woman and said, 2 hours ago you laughed in this courtroom. You told me this was nothing. Her hands started shaking. The same hands that were so casual before. I said, in my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be. Now let me pause here for a moment. I need to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone realize all at once that the rules really do apply to them? Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. And if you're still with me, hit that like button. At that moment, 2 federal agents stepped forward from the side of the courtroom. I watched those 2 federal agents step forward, and I could feel the entire courtroom freeze. Time didn't stop, but it slowed enough for every person in that room to feel the weight of what was happening. I've seen fear before. I've seen regret before. But what I saw on her face in that moment was something different. It was realization. The woman who stood confidently in front of me just minutes earlier now looked small. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for an exit that no longer existed. Her hands shook so badly she tried to hide them by gripping the edge of the podium. I stood up slightly from my bench. I rarely do that. When I do, it's because the moment demands presence. I wanted her to see me clearly. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't personal. This was accountability. I said her name slowly. I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, this courtroom treats everyone equally. Earlier today, you laughed at consequences. Now you're facing them." She tried to speak. Her voice cracked. She said, "Your Honor, please, I didn't know this would..." I held up my hand gently. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting. I said, "You didn't know because you didn't want to know." That silence afterward was heavy. You could feel it press down on the room. The Assistant United States Attorney stepped forward again and explained calmly and clearly that the investigation involved misappropriation of funds, falsified records, and deliberate deception. He explained that victims were waiting for justice, real people, not numbers on a spreadsheet. As he spoke, I watched her face. Tears started rolling down her cheeks. Not dramatic, not loud, quiet tears, the kind that come when denial finally collapses. I thought about something my mentor told me early in my career. He said, "Frank, arrogance is the loudest mask fear ever wears." Standing there, I saw exactly what he meant. The federal agents approached her slowly, professional, respectful, no rush. One of them gently asked her to place her hands behind her back. She looked at me one last time. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since she walked into my courtroom, there was no arrogance left, just fear. She said, "Your Honor, I'm sorry." I nodded once. I said, "I hope you are, but apologies matter most when they're followed by accountability." The agents placed the handcuffs on her wrists. The sound of metal clicking shut echoed in the courtroom. I'll never forget that sound. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Her designer handbag slipped off her arm and fell to the floor. It landed softly, but no one moved to pick it up. Not one person. I thought about how much importance she placed on things. Shoes, reservations, status, and how quickly all of it meant nothing. The agents guided her toward the exit. As she passed the gallery, I noticed something else. People weren't staring with anger. They weren't whispering. They were quiet, watching, learning. When the door closed behind her, the room stayed silent for a moment longer. I let it. Silence has a purpose. I sat back down slowly. I removed my glasses and set them on the bench. I took a breath. I said, "Court will take a brief recess." People stood quietly. No chatter, no movement. Everyone filed out slowly. I stayed behind for a moment. I looked around my empty courtroom. I've spent most of my adult life in that room. I've seen the best and worst of people there. But days like that remind you why the law matters. When I returned to my chambers later, Christina followed me in. She didn't say anything at first. She just handed me a stack of files and set my coffee down. Finally, she said softly, "That was something." I nodded. That was all I could say. Later that afternoon, the Assistant United States Attorney came to my chambers. He closed the door and sat across from me. He explained the investigation in more detail. He told me how long it had been ongoing. He told me how many people were affected. The numbers were staggering, millions of dollars, retirees who trusted her, small businesses that relied on her advice, people who lost savings they would never recover. I sat there listening, feeling the weight of it settle in. I told him something honestly. I said, "You know, this morning I almost treated her case like nothing more than a parking violation." He nodded and said, "That's how these cases hide, Your Honor, behind normal moments." That sentence stayed with me. That evening when I went home, my wife took one look at me and knew it had been a heavy day. After decades together, she doesn't need explanations. We sat at the kitchen table. I told her the story, not the details, just the lesson. She listened quietly. Then she said something simple that grounded me. She said, "You did your job, and you did it with integrity." That night I lay awake longer than usual. I thought about both women from that day. One who came into court broken by circumstances, another who came in protected by arrogance, and how the law met them both where they stood. Weeks passed. Life moved on. Court always does. Then about 2 months later, something arrived in my chambers that made me stop everything. A letter. It was handwritten. The return address was from a correctional facility. I'll be honest with you, I almost didn't open it, not because I was afraid, but because I've read many letters over the years. Some are excuses, some are manipulation, some are anger disguised as regret. But something told me to open it. I sat down at my desk and unfolded the letter slowly. She wrote that she didn't expect me to read it. She wrote that sitting in my courtroom was the first time in years she felt exposed. Not embarrassed, exposed. She wrote that she had built her life on appearances, that she believed money insulated her from consequences. She said that moment standing in front of me shattered that belief. She wrote one sentence that I still remember word for word. She wrote, "I thought money made me important. I was wrong." I set the letter down and stared at my desk for a long time. I don't know what will happen to her. That's not my role. But I do know something important happened that day. Accountability finally entered her life. A few days after that, something else happened that brought everything full circle. The single mother from earlier in the week came back to see me, not in court. She requested permission to visit my chambers. When she stood in my doorway, she looked different, still tired, still carrying responsibility, but lighter somehow. I invited her in. She thanked me again, but this time her voice was steadier. She told me she had gone on 3 interviews. She told me she had transportation again. And then she said something that brought tears to my eyes. She said, "My kids saw me cry that day, but it was the first time they saw me cry because someone helped us." I had to look down. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I don't hide my emotions, but I don't let them take over either. She said she promised herself she would pay it forward someday. I told her that was all I ever hoped for. About a year later, I heard something that made me smile. Funds recovered from that federal case were used to support community programs, scholarships, job training, support services. And do you know who received one of the first scholarships? Her daughter. When I heard that, I sat back in my chair and smiled. That's justice working quietly, slowly, the way it's supposed to. I think about that day often. I think about what it taught me. I think about how thin the line can be between stability and collapse. My father came to this country with nothing. He taught me that respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. He taught me that character shows when nobody is impressed by you. After 40 years on this bench, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. Money can't buy integrity, it can't buy respect, and it can't buy your way above accountability. After that young mother left my chambers, I stayed seated for a long time. I didn't rush to the next file. I didn't check my watch. I just sat there, alone with my thoughts. I've learned over the years that moments like that deserve space. If you rush past them, you miss what they're trying to teach you. I kept thinking about the contrast between those 2 women. One walked into my courtroom carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. The other walked in carrying confidence so heavy it blinded her. Both stood in the same place. Both faced the same law, and yet they experienced it so differently. That's something people don't always understand. The law doesn't change, but how it meets you depends on how you arrive. I thought about my father again. He worked with his hands his whole life. He never had money, but he always had pride. He used to tell me, "Frank, when you don't have much, your word is everything. Lose that, and you lose yourself." I wondered when that other woman had lost hers. The next few weeks passed like most do. Court sessions, paperwork, decisions. But that case stayed with me. I found myself thinking about it late at night. about how easily arrogance can grow when it's never challenged, about how dangerous it is when someone stops believing consequences apply to them. Then the letter arrived. I remember exactly where I was sitting when Christina brought it in. It was mid-morning. The sunlight was coming through the window at just the right angle. She placed the envelope on my desk without saying a word. I could tell by the way she looked at me that she knew what it was. I picked it up and turned it over slowly. Correctional facility, inmate number, no return name at first glance. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I asked myself a simple question: do I want to hear this? Not because I was afraid, but because sometimes letters are written to ease the writer's conscience, not to confront truth. But my father also taught me something else. He taught me that if someone is willing to speak honestly, you owe them the respect of listening. So I opened it. Her handwriting surprised me. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't sloppy. It was careful, deliberate, like someone taking their time with their thoughts for the first time in a long while. She wrote about sitting alone at night, about silence, about how loud silence can be when there's nothing left to distract you. She wrote about how she replayed that moment in my courtroom over and over in her mind. She said she remembered laughing. She said she remembered my face when she did. And she wrote that she had never seen disappointment look so clear. That line stopped me. She wrote about growing up believing that success meant never being questioned, that money meant freedom, that consequences were for people who didn't figure things out. She admitted that she built her life on shortcuts, on justifications, on convincing herself that no one was really being hurt. Then she wrote something I didn't expect. She wrote that the most frightening moment wasn't the handcuffs. It wasn't the arrest. It was standing in front of me and realizing she couldn't buy her way out of that silence. I folded the letter slowly when I finished. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something closer to sadness. Sadness for wasted years. Sadness for lessons learned too late. I placed the letter in my drawer. Some things don't belong on display. They belong in reflection. That same afternoon, something else happened that reminded me why mercy matters just as much as accountability. The single mother returned to the courthouse, not because she had to, because she wanted to. She asked Christina if she could see me. Christina came into my chambers and told me she was there. I said yes without hesitation. When she stepped inside, I noticed how different she looked, still modest, still humble, but there was a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. She told me she had started working part-time, not her dream job, but work, honest work. She said her kids were proud of her. She said they talked about that day in court like it was a turning point. She told me something I'll never forget. She said, "My daughter asked me if the judge was an angel." I laughed softly and shook my head. I told her I was just a man doing his job, but inside I felt something warm, not pride, purpose. She said that moment taught her children something important, that asking for help isn't weakness, that the law isn't always something to fear, that kindness can exist inside rules. When she left, I stood by my window again. I watched her walk down the steps of the courthouse. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. She walked forward. That image stayed with me. Weeks later, I learned more about where the recovered money was going: programs, scholarships, support systems, quiet investments into people who would never make headlines. And when I heard that her daughter received one of those scholarships, I closed my eyes and smiled. Justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Let me pause here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever seen how one decision can ripple outward in ways you never imagined? How one moment can shape years? If you've experienced something like that, tell me in the comments. And if you believe these stories matter, hit that like button for me. I think about that day often, especially when people ask me why I still do this job, why I still sit on this bench after 40 years. The answer is simple: because the law isn't just about punishment. It's about balance. It's about knowing when to be firm and when to be human. I've seen people come into my courtroom angry and leave humbled. I've seen people come in broken and leave hopeful, and I've seen people come in arrogant and leave silent. All of those moments matter. People sometimes think mercy is weakness. It isn't. Mercy takes courage. It takes judgment, and it takes faith that people can rise when you give them room. But mercy without accountability is chaos, and accountability without mercy is cruelty. A judge has to walk that line every day. I think about my grandson sometimes. He just turned 12. Watching him grow reminds me why this work matters. What kind of world are we modeling for the next generation? One where money talks louder than truth, or one where character still means something? I know which one I believe in. I believe respect costs nothing but is worth everything. I believe that when someone stands in my courtroom, their bank account stays outside. And I believe that no matter how long you've been on this bench, there's always something new to learn about people. That day reminded me of all of that, and I'm not done yet, because there's still more to this story, more reflection, more lessons, and more questions I want to ask you. As time passed, that day continued to come back to me in quiet moments. Not during the noise of court, but during the stillness. Late evenings, early mornings, the moments when you're alone with your thoughts and can't distract yourself with work. I would sit at my kitchen table with my coffee, staring out the window, thinking about how thin the line really is, how quickly life can change. One lost job, one wrong decision, one moment of arrogance or one moment of compassion. People often ask me if being a judge makes you cynical. They assume after seeing so many mistakes, you start expecting the worst. But I've found the opposite to be true. The longer I sit on this bench, the more I believe people are shaped by what meets them when they fall. Some fall and are met with indifference. Others fall and are met with judgment alone. And sometimes, if we're lucky, someone falls and is met with understanding and accountability at the same time. That's the balance I try to hold on to. I thought again about the woman who laughed in my courtroom. I thought about how confident she was that morning, how untouchable she believed herself to be. I wondered how many times she had walked through life without being told no. And then I thought about the single mother, how many times life had told her no, how many doors had closed in her face before she ever stepped into my courtroom. Both women stood before the same law, but life had prepared them very differently for that moment. I've learned that entitlement doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from never being challenged, from never being forced to slow down and see the impact of your actions. I don't take joy in watching someone fall. I never have. Justice isn't about humiliation. It's about truth. And the truth that day was simple. One woman respected the law even while struggling under it. The other dismissed it because she thought she was above it. The law responded accordingly. A few weeks after receiving that letter, I saw Christina reading something at her desk. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. She said, "You'll like this." She handed me a short article. It was about community funding from recovered federal assets, quiet programs, no headlines, no fanfare. That's how justice should work, I thought, quietly, purposefully. Later that week, I ran into the single mother again by chance. She wasn't in court. She was leaving the building as I was arriving. She looked different again, stronger, more confident. She waved and smiled. I smiled back. That was enough. I didn't need thanks. I didn't need recognition. Seeing her moving forward was all the confirmation I needed. People sometimes misunderstand what judges do. They think it's about power, about control, about deciding who wins and who loses. It isn't. It's about responsibility. Every decision echoes beyond that room, into families, into futures, into lives you'll never fully see. That's why I listen carefully. That's why I ask questions. That's why I slow things down when others want them rushed. Because once a decision leaves that bench, you can't take it back. I remember something my mentor told me early in my career. He said, "Frank, never forget that every file on your desk represents a human being." I've never forgotten that. That day reminded me how true it still is. I also thought about what would have happened if that assistant United States attorney hadn't been in my courtroom that morning. What if she had walked out with nothing more than a fine? What if her arrogance had gone unchecked yet again? Justice sometimes arrives quietly, sometimes loudly, sometimes unexpectedly. That day, it arrived right on time. I also thought about forgiveness. People often confuse forgiveness with forgetting. They're not the same. Forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. It simply allows healing to begin. I don't know if the woman in custody will ever forgive herself. That's her journey. But I hope she continues to confront who she was and who she can still become. And I hope the single mother continues to build on that moment of relief she felt in my courtroom. I hope her children grow up knowing the law can be fair, that asking for help isn't shameful, that dignity matters. These are the lessons that stay with you, not the headlines, not the dramatic moments, the quiet understanding that one decision, made carefully, can change more than one life. I think about my father often, how proud he was when I became a judge, how seriously he took fairness. He didn't have money, but he had principles. He used to say, "Frank, when you treat people fairly, you sleep better at night." He was right. After 40 years on this bench, I still sleep well most nights. Not because every decision is easy, but because I try to make them honestly. That day tested me, not because the law was unclear, but because humanity was front and center, and I'm grateful for that test, because it reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. I've spent a lifetime in courtrooms, and I've learned that justice doesn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrives quietly, often disguised as an ordinary day. That morning felt ordinary when I woke up. Coffee, tie, files, the same routine I followed for decades. And yet, by the end of the day, I was reminded why I still walk into that building with purpose. I think people imagine judges as distant, detached. But the truth is, every case leaves a mark. Some leave a light one, others stay with you forever. That day stayed with me because it showed me both ends of the human spectrum: humility and arrogance, desperation and entitlement, gratitude and dismissal, and it all happened in the same room. I keep thinking about the moment the single mother stood in front of me, how carefully she chose her words, how she didn't ask for pity, she didn't blame anyone, she simply told the truth. That honesty mattered. It mattered more than any document in the file. When people come into my courtroom and tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, it gives me something to work with. It tells me they're willing to face reality. And facing reality is the first step toward change. Then I think about the other woman, how confidently she dismissed the process, how she believed inconvenience was the greatest injustice she could face. That wasn't confidence. That was insulation. Insulation built by money, status, and never being told no. I've learned something over the years. When someone has never been held accountable, they mistake privilege for permission. That's a dangerous mistake. I don't enjoy watching anyone's world collapse. Let me be clear about that. There is no satisfaction in fear, no joy in tears. Justice isn't revenge. It's correction. It's balance. What happened to her wasn't cruelty. It was reality finally catching up. I think about the sound of those handcuffs often, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quiet it was. Just a click. That's all it took. Years of arrogance undone by a sound that lasted less than a second. And I think about the silence that followed. No applause, no whispers, just understanding settling into the room. That silence taught more than words ever could. People ask me sometimes if money influences justice. My answer has always been simple. Money might delay consequences, but it can't erase them. The law has a long memory. It waits patiently. That day proved that. I also think about the ripple effect, how one decision touches more lives than you'll ever know. That single mother didn't just leave with her car. She left with dignity restored. Her children didn't just see their mother cry. They saw fairness in action. They learned that authority doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it means protection. That matters. Those children will grow up with a different understanding of the law because of that moment. They'll know it isn't always something to fear, that it can also be something that helps you stand back up. And the other woman? Her story became a warning, not spoken aloud but understood, a reminder that arrogance is fragile, that status is temporary, that the law doesn't bend for ego. I've seen many people change after moments like that, and I've seen some refuse to. Change is a choice. The law can open the door, but a person has to walk through it. When I received her letter, I didn't read it as a plea. I read it as the first honest conversation she'd had with herself. That matters, even if it comes late. I don't know what kind of future she'll build, but I do know she'll never forget standing in that courtroom. And sometimes memory is the beginning of wisdom. I keep that letter in my drawer, not as a reminder of her mistakes, but as a reminder of what unchecked arrogance can do. It's easy to lose perspective when life never pushes back. Perspective is a gift. Sometimes it comes gently. Sometimes it comes hard. The single mother's perspective came through struggle. The other woman's came through consequence. Both are teachers. I often think about my father in moments like this. He never had money, but he had clarity. He understood that fairness wasn't about winning. It was about doing right by others, even when no one was watching. He taught me that power should be used to protect, not to dominate. That authority without humility becomes tyranny. I carry those lessons into my courtroom every day. After 40 years, I've learned that justice isn't about being liked, it's about being fair. Some days fairness looks like mercy, other days it looks like firmness. Wisdom is knowing the difference. That day required both. I also want you to understand something else. Judges don't operate in isolation. Every decision sends a message, not just to the person before us, but to everyone watching, to the gallery, to the community, to the next generation. That day sent a clear message. Struggle is not shameful, entitlement is not immunity, and respect matters. I've had people stop me on the street years later and tell me they remember something I said in court, not a ruling, a sentence, a reminder that they carried with them. Words matter in that room, tone matters, listening matters. That's why I slow down, that's why I ask questions, that's why I look people in the eye, because once someone leaves that podium, the law has done its part. What they do next is up to them. I think about that young mother driving her kids to school now, maybe still struggling, maybe still tired, but moving forward. I think about her daughter walking into a classroom someday, knowing she earned a scholarship not because of privilege, but because of perseverance. That's justice working quietly. I think about the other woman sitting alone, finally without distractions, forced to confront herself. That's justice working firmly. Both outcomes matter. I've been asked why I still do this job after all these years, why I don't retire, why I don't slow down. This is why. Because every now and then, a day comes along that reminds you that what you do matters, that decisions matter, that character still matters. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her, or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that fairness still exists, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law. Every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.